The canvas walls of the old revival tent trembled in the wind, like they might tear at any moment. The wooden beams creaked, the bulbs strung along the ceiling flickered, and the air was heavy with the smell of wet soil from the summer rain outside. Inside, folding chairs scraped against the dirt floor as neighbors shuffled to make space. Mothers fanned their children with worn hymnals, while farmers in sweat-stained hats leaned forward, hungry for a word that might make sense of the troubles pressing on them. Pastor John raised his voice above the hum of a portable fan. "My friends," he said, his voice trembling but strong, "God has not abandoned this land. Though your barns stand half empty, though your sons and daughters have drifted away, though the world tells us faith is foolish, He is still here. He has not left us. He has not forgotten you." The people leaned in closer. John felt the familiar weight in his chest, the mixture of weariness from long travel and the fire that always rose when he spoke of Christ's mercy. His eyes scanned the crowd. He knew many of their stories: the widowed farmer in the third row who had buried his wife last winter, the young mother who worked 2 jobs just to keep the lights on, the old man whose hands still trembled from Vietnam. They came for comfort, for truth, for something that could anchor them in a world that seemed to spin faster every year. He took a deep breath and lifted his hand toward the makeshift cross at the front of the tent. "Tonight, I tell you, the Lord is calling us back to the simplicity of faith, back to the place where we lean not on our own understanding, but on His everlasting arms." And then it happened. A small voice broke through the hush. From the third row, a girl no older than 10 stood up. Her dress was worn, patched in places, her hair braided neatly by a loving hand. She closed her eyes, lifted her chin, and began to speak. Not in English, not in Spanish, not in any tongue John had ever heard. The sound was like a river rushing over stones, a song without melody yet full of rhythm, urgent and unbroken. The entire tent froze. A baby stopped crying. Even the buzzing of the fan seemed to fade beneath that stream of words. John's throat closed. He had been preaching for more than 30 years, from Oklahoma to Arkansas, from small towns in Kansas to the dusty roads of New Mexico. He had heard prayers whispered in hospital rooms, songs shouted on porches, confessions spoken in the stillness of midnight. But this child's voice, trembling yet fierce, struck something deeper. It was as though the fabric of the evening had been torn open and light poured through. He felt the weight of his microphone in his hand. His next verse, carefully chosen and prayed over, suddenly felt unnecessary. The words on his lips turned to dust. Slowly, with his throat tight and his eyes burning, Pastor John lowered the microphone until it slipped from his fingers and struck the floor with a hollow thud. The sound echoed, sharp and final, like a gavel striking wood. The girl's voice kept rising, then broke off as suddenly as it began. Silence returned, but it was no longer the same silence as before. It was charged, heavy, filled with questions. No one dared ask aloud. John wiped the corner of his eye with the back of his hand, but the tears kept coming. He knew this moment was not about him. Still, he could not escape the thought that whatever had just happened was meant for him as much as for anyone in the crowd. And though he stood before them as a preacher, in that instant he felt like a man stripped bare before God. The congregation sat motionless, waiting for his voice. He opened his mouth, but nothing came out. John's hand trembled as he bent to pick up the microphone from the dirt. The child's voice had already gone silent, leaving behind a hush so deep he could hear the soft crackle of the lanterns above. Everyone's eyes darted between him and the little girl. She stood still, clutching the edge of her faded dress, her chest rising and falling as if she'd run a mile. Her mother leaned toward her, whispering frantically. The girl only shook her head, her eyes wide, almost glowing with tears she hadn't let fall. John could feel the weight of dozens of expectant gazes pressing against him, waiting for him to interpret what had just happened. "Sweetheart," John said gently, his voice still hoarse. "What did you just say?" The girl looked down at her shoes. For a moment, John wondered if she would answer. Then, in the shyest of voices, she whispered, "I don't know, Pastor, the words just came." Somewhere in the tent, a woman gasped. A man muttered, "Gloria a Dios." Others shifted uncomfortably, as if they weren't sure whether they had just witnessed something holy or something troubling. John's mind raced. He knew the scriptures. He knew what St. Paul had written about tongues, about the Spirit interceding when words failed. But he also knew the skepticism that followed, any sign that didn't fit neatly into people's expectations. This was rural Oklahoma, not a Pentecostal revival in the city. Here faith was usually quieter, steadier. He cleared his throat again, still clutching the microphone like it might burn him. "My friends," he began slowly, "sometimes the Lord chooses the smallest among us to remind us that his voice is not bound by our understanding." A murmur ran through the tent. Some nodded, some frowned, others simply bowed their heads. John glanced at the girl again, who now sat down beside her mother, her little hands folded tightly in her lap. Inside, though, John's heart was in turmoil. He could not shake the sound of her words. They echoed in his mind with a strange familiarity, as though he had heard them before in a dream or in some long-forgotten prayer. He felt exposed, as if God had placed a mirror before him, forcing him to see something he had tried to avoid for years. He managed to finish the sermon, but his voice was thinner, less certain. When the final hymn ended, people lingered, whispering in small groups. A few came to hug him. Others asked the girl's mother questions. But John could barely respond. His chest was heavy, his throat raw, and a strange fear pressed on him. Later that night, after the tent had been folded and the last lantern extinguished, John sat alone in his truck, the rain pattering against the windshield. He replayed the moment again and again. What language had that child spoken, and why had it pierced him so deeply? For the first time in a long while, he felt something he tried to keep hidden from the people he preached to every week. Doubt. Doubt about his calling. Doubt about his strength. Doubt about whether he was still the preacher he once believed God had called him to be. He leaned forward, pressing his forehead against the steering wheel, whispering a prayer no one else would hear. "Lord, what are you trying to tell me?" But the only answer was the sound of rain. The highway stretched out before him like an endless ribbon of grey, cracked by the summer sun and littered with the dust of passing trucks. John had been driving for hours, his old Ford rattling with every bump, the worn tires humming against the asphalt. He kept one hand on the wheel, the other resting on the leather-bound Bible beside him, its edges frayed from decades of use. The revival in Ada had ended, but the sound of the girl's voice still echoed in his ears. He replayed it in his mind, those strange syllables spilling out like water from a spring, words that seemed to bypass language itself. The image of her small hands trembling, her mother's eyes darting nervously, the congregation's uneasy silence. It was all burned into him. He had been around long enough to know how quickly such a thing could be dismissed as emotionalism or dismissed as foolishness. But why had it undone him? He remembered the way his microphone slipped from his hand clattering against the floorboards, and the way his throat closed as if refusing to compete with whatever voice had spoken through that child. He had felt naked, unprepared, like God himself had stepped into the tent to remind him of something long forgotten. The rain had passed, leaving the Oklahoma fields damp and steaming under the morning sun. He pulled into a gas station outside, Shawnee, the kind with a flickering fluorescent sign and a coffee pot that looked older than some of the customers. The smell of burnt coffee and gasoline mingled in the air. Inside, he poured himself a cup of coffee from the crusted pot and stood at the counter. The woman behind it, grey-haired and thin, gave him a smile. "You're the preacher, ain't you? Heard you were in Ada last night." John blinked. "News. Travels fast." "My sister was there," she said. "Said a little girl spoke on something. She said you cried." John's grip tightened on the styrofoam cup. "I did," he admitted quietly. The woman nodded, her eyes kind. Sometimes tears are a sermon, too. Her words landed heavy on him, but he only managed a weak smile. He paid for the coffee and stepped outside. Sitting in the truck again, he thought of his own daughter, Sarah. He hadn't spoken to her in months. The last time they talked, she had raised her voice, telling him that his preaching had cost their family too much. He had brushed it off, told himself she would understand one day. But maybe, just maybe, that was what the girl's voice had been about. A message not for the crowd, but for him. As the sun climbed higher, he leaned back in his seat, closed his eyes and whispered, "Lord, I need your help. I'm tired. I don't even know if I'm still leading these people right, and if I've failed my own daughter." His voice cracked again, and he couldn't finish. He turned the key, the old truck shuddering to life. Ahead lay more highways, more tents, more faces filled with hunger for hope. But in his chest, a storm still rumbled, louder than any applause. He wondered if he could keep going. And yet, as the truck rolled onto the road again, a small sound rose in his memory, like a child's voice speaking words he couldn't understand, but somehow knew were meant to heal something broken. What if God was asking him to listen more closely? By the time John pulled into a small roadside motel in Seminole, the sun had already dipped low, bleeding orange into the horizon. The neon sign outside flickered vacancy, buzzing faintly against the quiet evening air. He parked the truck, grabbed his worn Bible and duffel bag, and checked into a room that smelled faintly of disinfectant and old curtains. The bed creaked under his weight as he sat down. His knees ached from standing all night in the tent, and his back still carried the echo of years of farm labor before the priesthood had claimed him. He pulled off his boots and let them thud against the floor, rubbing his tired feet. The girl's voice still haunted him. He could hear those flowing syllables as if they were playing from the motel walls themselves. He tried to pray, but the words tangled in his chest. "Lord, what are you saying to me?" he whispered, staring at the ceiling where a water stain spread like an ink blot. He thought of his daughter again, Sarah with her long, dark hair, her eyes full of questions he'd never managed to answer. She had wanted him home more, wanted him at her graduations, her birthdays, her quiet victories. He had always told her the people needed him, that God's work came first. But now, sitting in a room where the hum of an old refrigerator was the only company, he wondered if he had confused his work with his worth. A knock at the door startled him. He shuffled over, opening it to find a man in his late 30s holding a six-pack of soda. "Preacher John?" the man asked. "Yes," John said, cautious. The man smiled, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Name's Daniel. I was at the tent last night. Figured you might want some company. Folks are still talking about what happened with that little girl." John stepped aside, uncertain but too weary to argue. Daniel entered, setting the sodas on the dresser. His hands shook slightly, like someone who'd been without sleep. "I don't know what she said," Daniel continued, lowering his voice, "but when she spoke, I felt something, like a warning. Or maybe a promise. I can't shake it." John sank into the chair by the small table. "You're not the only one. I've been asking God all day what he meant." Daniel leaned forward. "What if it was cement for you?" The words hit like a hammer. John wanted to argue, but instead he stared at his hands, remembering Sarah's last words before she slammed the door. "You preach love to strangers, but can't sit still long enough to love me." Silence fell heavy in the room. Daniel cracked open a soda, slid it across the table, and studied him with searching eyes. "Preacher," he said softly, "maybe God's telling you to go home." John felt his chest tighten again. Go home? To what? To the silence of a daughter, who no longer answered his calls, to the ghosts of mistakes he couldn't undo. He lowered his head, tears stinging his eyes once more. And then Daniel said something so quiet, so deliberate, that John nearly dropped his drink just as he had dropped the microphone the night before. "Your daughter is waiting for you," Daniel said, his voice steady, almost heavy with certainty. John froze. The can of soda in his hand felt like it weighed 100 pounds. He hadn't told anyone in Ada about Sarah. Hardly anyone in Oklahoma even knew he had a daughter. His ministry kept him moving, and his private life was something he rarely shared. He looked up sharply. How do you know about my daughter?" Daniel didn't flinch. He set his soda on the table, untouched, and folded his hands. "When that little girl spoke last night, I heard something different than the others. It wasn't just sounds. To me it was plain as day. She was calling your name, Pastor. She said, 'Go to her before it is too late.'" John felt the room spin. His chest tightened with a mix of fear and shame. Sarah, his only daughter, the child he had left in the care of his sister, when the calling to preach had burned too strong to ignore. He had told himself that preaching the gospel was the greatest act of love he could give her, that God would honor the sacrifice. But Sarah hadn't seen it that way. She had seen absence, silence, and unanswered prayers for a father who was never home. He sat back, trying to steady his breath. "Daniel," he said, "I don't know what you think you heard, but my daughter hasn't spoken to me in months. She doesn't want me near her." Daniel leaned closer, his eyes fixed on John's. "Maybe she doesn't want you near because you've never gone after her. Maybe she's waiting for you to fight for her." The words cut deep, sharper than any insult or accusation. For years, John had stood before strangers, calling them to repent, to return to God, to reconcile with their families. He had preached forgiveness, preached love, preached reconciliation. And yet when it came to his own child, he had allowed pride and fear to silence him. That night, John hardly slept. He tossed on the thin mattress, hearing the girl's strange words in his dreams. At dawn, he knelt by the side of the bed, his old knees aching against the carpet. "Lord, if this is from you, show me the way. I don't know how to reach her anymore. I don't know if she'll even answer the door." The silence pressed, back against him, heavy and unyielding. But as he rose and looked into the cracked mirror above the dresser, he saw his own tired eyes staring back, and he knew he couldn't keep running. By noon, his truck was heading south toward Fort Worth, Texas, toward Sarah, and with every mile that passed, his heart pounded harder. What if she slammed the door again? What if she refused to see him? Worse. What if Daniel was right, and there wasn't much time left? The road to Texas was long, lined with gas stations, shuttered diners, and fields that seemed to stretch without end. John's old Ford trembled when he pushed past 60, and the engine rattled like a coffee can full of stones. He didn't mind. The noise kept him awake. The silence inside his chest was heavier than the hours of driving. He stopped at a rest area near Gainesville, Texas. The August heat pressed down like a heavy quilt, thick and relentless. He bought a styrofoam plate of biscuits and gravy from a food truck parked near the pumps. The gravy was lukewarm, peppery, and tasted faintly. Just flour, but it filled the empty space in his stomach. As he ate, he noticed a young man sitting on the curb by the vending machines, head in his hands. His backpack looked worn, straps frayed, as though he had been on the road too long. "You all right, son?" John asked. The young man looked up, eyes bloodshot. "Bus ticket's short $10, he muttered. "Trying to get to Dallas. My mum's in the hospital." John hesitated. He had only $40 left in his wallet, enough for gas to Fort Worth and a cheap dinner before the next service. He'd been living on faith for years, but lately, faith had begun to feel like walking a tightrope with no net. He thought of Sarah again. The last time she asked for money, he told her he couldn't help. He told her to pray harder. He remembered the hurt in her voice. Now here was another child, not much older than Sarah had been when he left. John reached into his wallet, pulled out the 40, and pressed it into the young man's hand. "You'll need food when you get there," John said. The boy's eyes widened. "But preacher, what about you?" John forced a smile. "The Lord has never failed me yet." The boy stood, tears glistening on his cheeks. "Thank you," he whispered, before hurrying toward the bus station doors. John sat back down in the truck, his stomach twisting, not from the food, but from the realization that once again he had given to a stranger what he had withheld from his own blood. He felt no peace, only a deeper ache. As the sun dipped behind the horizon and the sky bled into purple, John drove the last stretch toward Fort Worth. His hands clenched the wheel until his knuckles turned white. He rehearsed what he might say to Sarah, each sentence falling apart before it left his lips. When he finally pulled into her street, his chest tightened. The house looked smaller than he remembered. A string of wind chimes tinkled by the door. He sat for a long time in the cab, listening, his heart pounding harder than the engine ever could. Finally, he stepped out, walked to the door, and lifted his hand to knock. His knuckles hovered over the wood. For a long moment, he froze. What if she didn't answer? What if she did, and told him to leave? The night air was thick and hot. He swallowed hard, raised his hand again, and knocked. The sound echoed through the quiet street. From inside, he heard footsteps. Then the door creaked open. The door, opened only a few inches, just wide enough for John to see a sliver of the life he had missed. Sarah stood there, her hair pulled back into a messy bun, her eyes rimmed with fatigue. For a moment she didn't say anything, just stared at him like she wasn't sure if he was real. "Daddy," she whispered, and the word hit him harder than any sermon ever could. He tried to speak, but his throat caught. "Sarah," he managed, I was nearby. Thought I'd stop by." She looked past him at the truck parked under the dim streetlight, at the folded tarp and tent poles stacked in the back. Then her eyes returned to his, colder now. "You're never just nearby," she said. "You're always passing through." John's chest sank. He nodded slowly, accepting the truth in her words. "You're right, I've been gone too long, but I needed to see you." From inside he heard a baby crying, sharp, desperate wails. Sarah turned her head quickly, then back to him. "This isn't a good time." "A baby?" he asked, stepping forward instinctively. "Sarah, is that—" Her hand tightened. On the door. "It's none of your business," she said firmly. "Please, I can't do this tonight." He wanted to push, to ask the questions burning on his tongue. Was he a grandfather? Why hadn't she told him? But the pain in her eyes held him back. He had seen that look before, years ago, when he chose the road instead of staying with her and her mother. He couldn't bear to see it again. He lowered his head. "I understand, I'll go." She opened her mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. The door shut with a soft click. John stood there in the warm night, listening to the muffled cries of the child inside. His hand brushed the wood once, gently, before he turned back to the truck. The parking lot of a nearby diner became his refuge for the night. He sat in the cab, window cracked, the sound of crickets and distant highway traffic mixing with his own restless thoughts. He opened his Bible, but the words blurred. He tried to pray, but each sentence faltered. Instead, he thought of the little girl in Ada, the one who had spoken words that weren't words. He wondered if Sarah had heard them too. He wondered if they had been for her as much as for him. John bowed his head, the pages of the Bible open on his lap. "Lord," he whispered, voice trembling, "if she's in trouble, show me how to help her. Don't let me fail her again, please." The night was silent, save for the hum of insects. But in that silence his heart pounded with something that felt like both fear and hope. He leaned his head back against the seat, closed his eyes, and tried to rest. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would try again. Tomorrow, he would knock harder. John woke with the stiffness of a man who had slept sitting up. The sun was already rising, casting a pale orange glow across the diner's cracked parking lot. His neck ached, and his shirt clung damply to his back from the August heat that never seemed to fade, even at night. He splashed water on his face, in the diner restroom, and ordered the cheapest breakfast on the menu, scrambled eggs and toast with coffee strong enough to burn his throat. As he sat in the booth, staring at the steam rising from the cup, he rehearsed what he might say to Sarah when he knocked again. But before he could gather his thoughts, a voice interrupted. "Preacher John?" He looked up to see a young waitress with a notepad tucked into her apron. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a ponytail, and her eyes carried that mix of curiosity and caution he had grown used to on the road. "I was at a tent service in Ada a year ago," she said. "You prayed for my daddy when he lost his job at the plant." She smiled faintly. "He's working again now. I just wanted to thank you." John's chest tightened. He forced a smile, nodded, and said, "That's good news. God is faithful." But inside her words twisted like a knife. How many strangers had he prayed for, comforted, encouraged? And yet, his own daughter's door had closed in his face. After breakfast, he drove back to Sarah's street. He parked a few houses down, nerves crawling in his stomach. This time, when he knocked, she opened the door fully. Her hair was unkempt, dark circles under her eyes. The baby, his grandson he realized now, was in her arms, fussing softly. She didn't invite him in, but she didn't shut the door either. "You shouldn't have come back," she said, her voice low. John swallowed hard. "I had to, Sarah. I know I wasn't there for you. I can't change that, but I want to be here now." She laughed bitterly. "Now? When it's convenient for you?" Where were you when I graduated? When Mom died? When I needed someone to help me raise him?" She shifted the baby on her shoulder, tears threatening at the corners of her eyes. "You chose strangers over your own family." The words pierced deeper than any accusation he'd faced from a congregation. He wanted to explain, to tell her he had believed he was following God's call, that every mile he drove was meant to serve something bigger. But standing there, facing the daughter who had carried so much alone, those excuses sounded hollow. "I was wrong," he said simply, his voice breaking. "I thought I was serving God, but I was running from my own failures, from being the father you needed." Sarah's eyes searched his, torn between anger and a longing she tried to hide. The baby squirmed, letting out a sharp cry. She turned away, bouncing him gently, and whispered, "I don't know if I can trust you." John's throat tightened. "Then let me earn it. I don't want sermons or stages right now. I just want to sit here and hold my grandson." For a long moment, the only sound was the baby's cries and the faint rustle of wind chimes at the door. Finally, Sarah stepped back, leaving the door cracked open. It wasn't an invitation, not yet, but it wasn't a rejection either. John knew that for the first time in years, the next step wasn't about another town, another tent. It was about standing still long enough to love the one person he had failed the most. The door never opened all the way, but Sarah didn't close it either. John stood in the doorway, watching her gently rock the baby until his cries softened into small whimpers. His heart ached with every sound, every glimpse of the tiny face pressed against her shoulder. Finally, Sarah sighed. "You can come in for a little while, but don't think this means everything is fixed." John nodded, his eyes moist. "I wouldn't dream of it." Inside, the living room was small but warm. Toys were scattered. Across the rug, a folded blanket draped over the couch. The air smelled faintly of baby powder and reheated coffee. Sarah lowered herself into the worn armchair, adjusting the baby in her arms. "His name's Elijah," she said quietly, as if testing whether she could trust him with the truth. John whispered the name back to himself. Elijah. He swallowed hard, emotion tightening his throat. "He's beautiful." Sarah didn't respond. She stared at the baby, her lips pressed in a thin line. John wanted to ask about the father, about how she was managing, about everything he had missed. But he stayed silent, afraid one wrong word might send him back out the door. After a long pause, Sarah looked up. "Why now, Dad? Why after all these years?" He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, his weathered hands clasped. "Because a little girl in Ada spoke words that broke me in half. Because a stranger reminded me that my daughter still needed me. And because I can't keep preaching about love while ignoring the one person I owe it to the most." Sarah's eyes filled with tears, but she blinked them away quickly. "Do you know how many birthdays you missed? How many nights I waited for? A call? You prayed with strangers while I prayed you'd come home." John's chest felt like it might cave in. "I know, and I can't give those years back. All I can do is ask for one chance to do better with the years I have left." The baby stirred, fussing again. Sarah handed him a bottle, her hands trembling slightly. John hesitated, then stretched out his arms. "May I?" She froze, torn. Finally, she placed Elijah into his arms. John cradled the boy carefully, the small weight pressing against him like a sacred trust. Elijah's tiny fingers wrapped around his thumb, and John's eyes blurred with tears. In that moment, he felt the years of guilt, regret, and running crash over him. Yet beneath it all, a flicker of hope stirred. Maybe God wasn't finished with him yet. Maybe this was the beginning of something new. Sarah watched quietly, her expression unreadable. The silence was heavy, but not as suffocating as before. John rocked Elijah gently, whispering, "I don't deserve this, but thank you, Lord, for giving me another chance." And just as he spoke, Sarah finally exhaled a shaky breath. It wasn't forgiveness. Not yet. But it was something close. Something fragile. Something worth holding on to. For the first time in years, John sat across from his daughter at a kitchen table. The wood was scratched, a faint ring from a coffee mug marking its surface. Sarah poured herself another cup, leaving the pot half full, but didn't offer him any. She leaned back in her chair, arms crossed, watching him like someone who had opened the door to a stranger but wasn't ready to call him family. "You think holding Elijah makes up for everything?" she asked, her voice steady but sharp. John shook his head. "No. Nothing could make up for the nights you cried alone. Nothing could make up for missing your mother's last breath. I'll live with that until the Lord takes me home." Sarah's lips pressed into a thin line. She took a sip of coffee, staring at the dark liquid as though it could shield her from his words. "Then why are you here? What do you really want?" John swallowed hard. "I want a chance to be your father again, not your preacher, not the man who's always on the road, just your dad." The baby monitor crackled from the bedroom, Elijah letting out a soft cry. Sarah stood, disappearing down the hallway. John sat alone in the kitchen, staring at the steam rising from her coffee cup. His own hands trembled as he clasped them together. He remembered nights in motels just like this one, cheap furniture, quiet rooms, the hum of an old fridge. When he convinced himself that Sarah was fine, that God would fill the space he had left empty. But the truth pressed harder now. He had abandoned her in the name of ministry. When Sarah returned, Elijah in her arms, she sat again, eyes red but dry. "Do you even know how many times I tried to call you? Do you remember the Christmas when I was 12? I waited by the window until midnight. You never came." John's chest tightened. He remembered the night. He had been preaching in a tent outside Amarillo, the wind tearing at the canvas while people clung to his words. He told himself God's work was worth the sacrifice, but looking at Sarah now he saw only a broken promise. "I remember," he said softly, "and I hate myself for it." Sarah's eyes glistened. She looked at Elijah, then back at him. "You can't just show up now and expect me to trust you. People don't change overnight." John nodded. "You're right. But I'm not asking for overnight. I'm asking for time, to prove I can be here, to prove I can stay." The silence stretched. Elijah cooed softly, gripping Sarah's finger. She sighed, exhaustion pulling at her voice. "Then you'd better be ready, because I won't let him go through what I went through." Her words were firm, but her eyes no longer carried the same wall of steel. For the first time, John saw a crack in her defenses, not forgiveness, not yet, but the possibility of something fragile and real. He bowed his head, whispering a prayer she could barely hear. "Lord, give me the strength not to run this time." John stayed in Fort Worth longer than he had planned. Each day, he found himself parked in Sarah's driveway or sitting on her couch, doing the simple things he had never done before. Washing dishes, holding Elijah while Sarah took a shower, picking up groceries when her car wouldn't start. It wasn't easy. Sarah kept her guard high, her words clipped, her eyes always searching for cracks in his promises. But slowly, moments began to shift. Elijah smiled when John rocked him. Sarah let him cook breakfast once, eggs and toast just like he ate on the road. She didn't compliment it, but she didn't complain either. One evening, as the sun dipped behind the neighborhood roofs, Sarah sat across from him at the kitchen table. "Are you planning to set up another tent around here?" she asked. John shook his head. "Not this time. I'm here for you." Her eyes narrowed. "You've said that before. What makes this different?" He took a long breath. "Because this time, I believe God is telling me to put down the microphone and pick up what I left behind." The words hung heavy between them. Sarah leaned back, arms crossed, not ready to surrender to hope. But she didn't argue. That Sunday morning, John followed her to a small brick church on the corner of Hemphill Street. He hadn't been in a pew as a guest in years. He sat quietly beside her, listening as another man preached. The hymns rose old and familiar. "Blessed assurance, how great thou art." His throat tightened, and for once he sang not as a leader, but as a father trying to belong. After the service, the pastor, a kind-eyed man named Reverend Lewis, shook John's hand. "Sarah tells me you're a preacher yourself." "Been on the road most of my life," John admitted. Reverend Lewis nodded. "Sometimes the Lord calls us to the road, sometimes he calls us home." The words pierced John's heart. He glanced at Sarah, who was adjusting Elijah's blanket, pretending not to listen. That evening, Sarah surprised him. "We're having a few friends over for dinner this week," she said, almost reluctantly. "You can come if you want." John nodded quickly, his chest swelling with gratitude. "I'd be honored." That night, back in the small motel where he still slept, he knelt beside the bed. "Thank you, Lord," he whispered, "for a door that's opening even if it's just a crack." But deep inside, he knew the real test was still ahead. He had been given an invitation, not forgiveness, a chance, not redemption. One wrong step could shatter it all. He pressed his forehead into the thin mattress, tears wetting the fabric. "Don't let me fail her again." The night of the dinner came sooner than John expected. Sarah's small house filled with the sounds of conversation and clinking dishes. Two of her neighbors arrived with casseroles, and a woman from her church brought cornbread fresh from the oven. The air was warm, fragrant with roasted chicken and buttered rolls. John felt out of place at first, standing in the corner while Sarah carried Elijah from guest to guest. He wasn't used to being part of something that wasn't centered on his preaching. For decades, people looked to him for answers, for a message, for a prayer. Tonight, no one expected him to lead. He was simply Sarah's father. At least, that's how they introduced him. When the meal began, he sat quietly at the end of the table. He listened as the others talked about jobs, children, and the rising cost of groceries. Ordinary lives, ordinary struggles, and yet it felt holy in its own way. Halfway through the meal, a neighbor asked Sarah, "So, your dad's a preacher?" Must be something, growing up with that. The question hung in the air. Sarah's fork paused halfway to her mouth. For a moment, John braced himself for her to recount the years of absence, the birthdays missed, the loneliness. But she only said, "It was complicated." Her eyes flicked to him, then back to her plate. John lowered his gaze, grateful she had chosen mercy over bitterness in that moment. Later, when the dishes were cleared and the guests were leaving, Sarah lingered in the kitchen. John stepped in to help dry the plates. The silence between them was less sharp now, softened by the rhythm of work. "You did all right tonight," she said finally, handing him a dish towel. John smiled faintly. "I was just trying not to get in the way." She studied him for a moment, then shrugged. "That's new." The words stung, but they also carried a trace of humor, almost like an olive branch. He chuckled softly, shaking his head. "Fair enough." As the night quieted and Elijah slept in his crib, John sat alone on the couch, staring at the small family photos on Sarah's wall. Pictures of her as a child, ones he barely remembered being taken. Pictures of her with friends he didn't know, her whole life, framed in snapshots he had missed. He whispered a prayer so soft only the walls could hear. "Lord, if I'm to be part of her life again, let it be steady, let it be real. Don't let me run this time." But as the house settled into silence, John felt the weight of the road, tugging at him again, the calls he hadn't returned, the churches expecting him next month, the promises made to congregations in towns already advertising his name. For the first time, he wondered if following God now meant disappointing the very people who had always depended on him. The following week brought a steady rhythm John wasn't used to: grocery runs, rocking Elijah to sleep, and evening walks. With Sarah down quiet streets where cicadas hummed in the trees. It was the closest thing to family life he had felt in decades. But the phone calls started coming. Pastors from small towns in Oklahoma and Kansas left messages on his voicemail. "Brother John, the tent's ready in Ardmore. We've already printed the flyers in Liberal. Folks are counting on you." Each message twisted his stomach tighter. He sat in the cab of his truck outside Sarah's house, listening to them play one after another. For 30 years, the road had been his life. His pulpit stretched across highways and dirt lots. But now the thought of leaving Fort Worth made his chest ache. That evening, Sarah caught him standing by the truck, phone in hand. "Calls from churches?" she asked flatly. He nodded. "They're expecting me." Her jaw tightened. "Of course they are. They always are." John sighed. "It's not that simple. These towns, they've been waiting months. People save up, invite their neighbors. They depend on me." Sarah's eyes flashed. "And what about me? Do you have any idea how many years I depended on you? Do you have any idea what it felt like when you never came?" Her words landed like a blow. He lowered his head, unable to meet her gaze. "I thought I was doing the Lord's work." "And maybe you were," she said, her voice breaking. "But you weren't doing the work of being my father. And now, Elijah has a grandfather he doesn't even know. Are you really going to leave him too?" John's throat tightened, his chest heavy with shame. He had preached about sacrifice his entire life, but in this moment, sacrifice looked different. Maybe it wasn't giving up comfort or money or miles on the road. Maybe it was staying put. That night, he sat alone in his motel room staring at his Bible. He opened to the Gospel of Luke, where Jesus tells of leaving the 99 to go after the one lost sheep. The words blurred through his tears. For years he had convinced himself the crowds were the one God was calling him to, but maybe, just maybe, his one was Sarah. His phone buzzed again with another voicemail. He turned it face down on the nightstand. For the first time, he didn't listen. The next morning, John drove to Sarah's house with a heaviness pressing on him. He found her in the yard, hanging laundry on a line that swayed gently in the summer breeze. Elijah sat in a stroller nearby, kicking his legs and cooing at the fluttering clothes. "Morning," John said softly. Sarah gave a cautious nod. "Morning." He stood there for a moment, watching the sunlight spill across the blankets, the simple rhythm of home life. He cleared his throat. "I need to tell you something." She paused, one hand gripping a clothespin. "What now?" "I've been getting calls, towns waiting for me, flyers already printed, people expecting me." Her shoulders stiffened, but she didn't turn around. "I told them I'm not coming," he said quietly. Slowly, Sarah turned to face him. Her eyes searched his, suspicious at first. "You what?" "I told them I'm not coming," he repeated. His voice shook, but his words held steady. "For years I've chased tents and towns, thinking that was obedience. But the truth is I've been running from you, from my failures. God didn't call me to save strangers while losing my own family." Tears welled in Sarah's eyes, though she tried to blink them away. "And what happens when the road calls you again?" John stepped closer, his voice breaking. "Then I'll remind myself of this moment, of Elijah's little hands, of your eyes asking me if I'll leave again, and I'll choose you." The silence between them was thick, filled with years of wounds and words unsaid. Finally, Sarah set down the basket of laundry. She walked over, Elijah's stroller wheels crunching softly on the gravel as she pulled it closer. She stood in front of him, arms crossed, jaw trembling. "If you're serious, Dad, then prove it. Stay. Don't just tell me you've changed. Show me." John nodded, tears spilling freely now. "I will, by God's grace I will." Sarah's face softened just slightly, a crack in the armor she had worn for so long. She didn't hug him, she didn't forgive him with words, but she didn't walk away either. And for John, that was the beginning of a miracle. Not the kind people shouted about in tents, but the quiet kind that rebuilt broken things brick by brick. That evening, he sat on the porch with Elijah asleep in his arms, the warm Texas night buzzing with crickets. He whispered a prayer into the silence. "Thank you, Lord, for giving me another chance to choose right. Help me not to waste it." Weeks passed, and the road felt further away with each sunrise. John stayed in Fort Worth, fixing small things around Sarah's house, walking Elijah to the park, sitting quietly in the pew beside his daughter on Sundays. Each day felt fragile, like it could break if he pressed too hard. But slowly, trust began to take root. One Sunday, Reverend Lewis asked if John would share a word with the congregation. John hesitated, the old instinct rising in him, the rhythm of a sermon, the pull of the microphone. But when he stepped to the pulpit, he didn't thunder like he had under tents. He spoke slowly, his voice soft. "For years, I thought the louder I preached, the more I was serving God. But somewhere along the way, I lost sight of the quiet callings, the people who needed me most. My daughter, she grew up without her father because I thought I was serving the Lord better on the road. And I was wrong. I can't undo those years, but by God's grace I can be faithful with what time I have left. The sanctuary was silent, save for the soft creak of pews as people leaned forward. Sarah sat in the third row, Elijah in her arms, listening with eyes full of tears. John's hands trembled as he gripped the pulpit. If you've been running from the people God gave you to love, stop, go home, apologize, sit with them, listen to them. Don't wait until the door is closed and the chance is gone. His voice cracked on the last word. He lowered his head, tears streaming freely, and stepped down. It was the shortest sermon he had ever given. Afterward, Sarah met him at the back of the church. She didn't speak at first, just wrapped one arm around him while holding Elijah with the other. It wasn't a full embrace, but it was the first hug she had given him in years. "Maybe we can try," she whispered. John nodded, overwhelmed. "That's all I ask." That night, sitting on the porch with Elijah asleep against his chest, John felt a peace he hadn't known in decades. It wasn't the thrill of packed tents or the applause of strangers. It was quieter, deeper, steadier. The girl's voice in Ada still echoed in his memory, those strange syllables that had shattered him. But now he understood. It wasn't a riddle to solve. It was a summons, a call not to another revival, but to his own redemption. He looked up at the night sky, stars flickering above the Texas rooftops, and whispered one last prayer. "Thank you, Lord, for letting me drop the microphone so I could finally hear you."